This week's video goes over the creation of a tall, lidded jar with a stepped lid. I'll be discussing each step along the way, together with going over numerous tips and tricks and the concepts that go into making my pots. Although this pot does have somewhat of a surprising finish, and I think it's going to end up being one of my favourite pieces from this year. Now, the initial thing I want to speak about is something that's cropped up in a number of my videos lately. It's about throwing the correct interior form so that the shape doesn't distort as it's fired. I found that often in the past, a number of my pots are ruined by this thin patch I leave towards the bottom. It's a remnant from pulling up the walls, and it means when I trim the outside of the pot, making the walls thinner, this part becomes particularly thin, and as there's all that weight above it, it can result in the shape itself slumping slightly, ruining the perfectly straight cylindrical form of the vessel. Since I started noticing this, I've been really focusing on my throwing, especially on larger pieces, as I was really just sick of this slight bump appearing around the very bottom. It's only subtle, and you don't necessarily easily notice it, but in many cases it's ruined pots that I really liked. So I need to look into it. I need to dissect my throwing and trimming, and just be a bit more careful with the initial thrown shapes I create. Here's another example, but this time the wall has just bowed in a touch, again ruining the otherwise straight walls. You can sort of see this thin patch when you look inside. The wall sort of bows outwards towards the bottom. And thus the fix is just being a bit more intentional when throwing. I have to remember to not try and lift up every last bit of clay and to leave some thickness in the wall. This way the vessel can still be trimmed to my liking without the shape itself deforming. So this is the plan, a cylinder like this, which I'll then top with a stepped lid. By the way, this slumping can also occur if your interior walls have throwing rings that are too prominent, as then, when you trim back from the outside, you create lots of thin patches in the wall, which can lead to both slumping and even the glaze being absorbed in different layers of thickness, depending on how thick the wall of clay is underneath it. Really, unevenness is the enemy of pottery when making it. So, to begin with, I've wedged up 2 lumps of clay. This one is probably about 2 kilos, and the section that will be the lid is probably about 800 grams. And I'm going to begin by throwing the body of the jar. The first step is to get this piece of clay centered. I do this initially by coning the lump of clay up and down a couple of times, before flattening it into a disc that doesn't undulate or move at all. I then find center and press my index finger and thumb sharply into the middle, and then I drag these digits outward to form the internal base of the jar. Now, I want to trim this pot to have quite an interesting foot, one that sort of mimics the shape that's going to be found on the lid itself. So for this reason I'm leaving the bottom slightly thicker than I normally would. I imagine it's about 2 centimeters thick at this stage. Now, before I begin pulling up the walls conventionally, I first thin them out by collaring them in. I make sure both my hands are wet and then I press in from either side, directing the clay upward and inward and thinning out what was a much thicker ring of clay that surrounded the opening. Trying to lift that up straight away would have been much more difficult, but by thinning it like this before I begin pulling, the initial pull becomes much easier. This is now the 4th pull on this piece, and I'm aiming to throw a cylinder that has relatively smooth walls on the inside, so I did some softening with a sponge to get rid of the more prominent throwing rings. With the walls scraped clean of slip, I indent the top to create the gallery the lid will slot into. This always causes the wall beneath it to just bulge out slightly, so I have to straighten and correct that before measuring the opening, which I do with a pair of calipers that are just gently dropped into the opening and then fastened tight. It's interesting, the slight indentation at the top helps the pot keep its shape as it's taken off the wheel. In order to get the measurement I need for the lid, I simply press my calipers into the clay left over on the wheel, and then I invert them but to measure these marks from the outside. I then throw my lump of clay onto the skim that's left over, as it helps it stick in place like Velcro, provided you haven't covered it in water. The style of lids I create are really easy to make. I form a low disc of clay, open it up, but leave plenty in the base and in the walls around the outside. And then I separate this outer portion of clay into 2 parts, the vertical section being the part that slots inside the jar, so it's this that I really need to get right. Although with that being said, I am throwing this portion of clay to be relatively thick. This way, if I have to trim it back to make it fit the jar later on, then that's no bad thing. It's really easy to remove clay at the leather hard stage when you're trimming, but it's much harder to add it back. So I prefer to leave my lids a bit on the thick side overall, and then I can trim them back as I see fit, to match the shape of the jar underneath it, without ever having to worry that I've made it either too small or having the need to add material back, meaning that the lid at this stage really is just a rough blank. And it's at this stage, the following day, now that the stoneware has turned leather hard, that both parts can be trimmed into their more refined shapes. The inside of the cylinder is not bad, it's pretty smooth from bottom to top, but there are some stronger marks towards the top, which I will trim and smooth over. I always start with the lid, which, like I told you, was thrown intentionally chunky, so I set it down, tap center it, and then double check how well the lid fits, just so I've got a good idea of how much I have to turn away. It was perhaps just slightly too tight, which is a good thing on the whole, as I'll easily be able to trim back the locating flange to make it fit. And before I forget, I secure the lid in place with 3 chunks of soft clay, as otherwise it'll shift off center as I trim. You can see how rough the shape is, and really lids are the types of things I prefer to throw quickly and crudely, and as I trim every single facet of them, there's simply no point at the throwing stage wasting time finessing them, and making them really perfect and crisp, as that's easier to do in many ways at this stage. I begin by flattening and smoothing most of the planes, and as I know the lid fits really well I didn't have to remove much material, but I do remove as much as I can from this interior part, as this will make the lid lighter once it's glazed and fired. The only thing I have to be slightly careful of is not making the floor of the lid too thin, as I'll be trimming a concave surface on this lid on the other side. Thus, if I make it too thin at this stage, then there simply won't be enough material for me to work with on the other for me to achieve the desired shape. I also don't go completely overboard on finishing at this point, as I will, later, use this lid in order to turn the base of the jar, which will inevitably scuff it up a tiny bit, so I'll wait until the very end to do that last bit of refinement. You can see some movement in this section, but, like I often speak about, as soon as it stops spinning, you cease to notice it. With the lid partly trimmed, I can now begin work on the body. It's attached to the wheelhead via a thin skim of slip just around the outside. You don't want to coat the entire base of the pot you're making, unless it's really small, as otherwise, in order to separate it, you'll have to slide a metal skim all the way underneath it. But this is a really great way of getting pots stuck down securely if you plan on trimming a significant portion of the object. Just for that last added bit of security, I pressed the edge of a plastic kidney right into this corner, pressing the wall into the metal wheelhead to create a more sealed join. And I promise you in this footage I really am trying to shake the pot loose. But if done properly, the slip quickly dries as the vessel is tap centered, and after that it should hold for a majority of the turning. I think this has to be one of my favourite moments in making. I grip my tungsten carbide trimmer really tightly, I'm going to dig it in and then really gradually move it down the wall of the vessel to really thin the walls. As I do this, I brace both hands together to stabilise my movements. And once the tool is actually cutting, I don't have to keep applying more and more pressure, instead I just have to keep the blade moving, as if I linger in one spot for too long I'll create a thin patch. What's also important with this first pass is holding the turning tool securely enough so that any slight undulation in the body doesn't influence the blade's movement. Instead, it's kept steady enough that I just slice through any unevenness, thus creating an even straighter, more accurate shape, as inevitably as clay dries from freshly thrown to leather hard, it will move a touch, especially since I took the vessel off the wheel using my hands and placed it on a bat. That's enough to impart some slight unevenness in the object, but through this trimming process I can make it perfect once again. Now, I just took it off the wheel to feel its weight, and it feels really light and balanced, but I'm going to attach it back down just so I can finish the walls off by scraping over them with a sharp metal rib and then burnishing it using a damp sponge and a plastic kidney. This pass with a metal scraper just gets rid of any of the more significant turning marks, and as the edge of the tool itself is nice and straight, it helps me achieve a very flat surface, which I will check with a ruler to see if there are any high points or sections of the wall that bow inward. To burnish the surface, if it is feeling particularly scratchy, I begin by running a soaked, dense sponge over the surface, and then I run a very smooth plastic kidney over this. I'm not particularly keen on a surface that looks really clearly sponged, so I try my best to avoid using them on the whole. Next, it's the lid's turn, which I'll trim in situ, slotted into the opening to hold it very securely in place as I trim. I will also use a spinner, which I place on top of the lid and through which I'll apply downward force. You can just press down using your fingertips against the bare clay of the lid, but I find I can be more consistent using one of these tools, as my hand that's pressing down remains stationary, instead of being slightly influenced by the rotation of the clay underneath it. Either way, as I trim, some kind of downward pressure has to be applied, as otherwise, as force is applied to the side of the lid, it'll try to jump up and out of the gallery. Now, on the outside I'm going to trim a stepped shape, but first I'll trim it to simply be nice and flat. This way I have a better blank canvas to work with. I begin by hollowing out the step from beneath, and I plan on making this section in line with the cylinder beneath it. For me, this sort of creates more of a monolithic shape. It's a subtle decorative feature that's always reminded me of Doric style columns, and I think as a standalone object it gives the vessel just a bit more prowess. Next, I'll turn the top so that it has a concave surface. This will help the glaze pool into it nicely, as if I were to leave the lid to be simply entirely flat. The thick glaze I coat over it will sort of create a domed shape like this once fired, and in doing so it adds a lot of curvature to the shape and sort of ruins the sleek, straight appearance I'm going for. So instead I trim a slightly concave surface. This means when I coat it with glaze, it'll melt and pool into this hollow, creating an entirely flat surface. It also helps the glaze break and cut through on the sharp edges, which gives visual interest to the object as a whole. You can see that here. As I trimmed the top flat and filled it with glaze, it fires into this carved out section, giving me a flat finish. This is something I think about a lot when making my pots. I know how a thick layer of glaze can change the finished shape, as the glaze melts and softens around the forms, adding curves and pooling into thick, glassy bands, often around the bottoms of pots. And I think it's partly for this reason that my work has become as angular and sharp as it is. The clay work influences the glaze above it, and by making more severe shapes it creates more interesting surface qualities, I think. As if I were just to make curved, rounded objects, the glaze would simply sit very flatly all over it. With the lid almost finished, I can now begin trimming the gallery of the jar. And again, here I'm just carving this section to have more distinct angles, as not only do I want a finer edge, as it gives me a more minimal finish, but this flat surface just underneath the lid will create a wonderful section for the glaze to pool into. And like with any sharp edges like this that will remain unglazed, I make sure to round and burnish them, as if left really sharp, the chances of this part chipping as the lid is taken on and off are very high. When I pause to go for a dog walk over lunch, I typically just wrap the pot, like so, as I really don't want it to dry out any further. With the lid and walls and rim trimmed, all that's left is to trim the base of this piece. So I separate it from the wheel by sliding a sharp metal knife underneath it, and then, really importantly, I scrape clean the wheel head, as I'll be trimming this jar upside down, placed on top of the lid. This means if there were any leftovers on the metal, they would very likely stick into the top of the lid I've just so carefully finished. The lid is then centered, secured in place with 3 bits of clay, and I can slot the jar on top of this to use it like a chuck in order to trim the bottom of the pot. I always begin by simply flattening it, as inevitably where I slid the metal skin beneath it to separate it from the wheel creates a rather rugged, torn surface. I bevel the outer edge, as this will help the object cast a shadow beneath itself, visually separating it from whichever surface it's placed on, together with creating an edge that's less likely to chip as the pot is picked up and put down, as it isn't quite so crisp. It also creates a barrier of sorts for when the object is glazed and fired. The bevel creates a tiny ledge, which means when the glaze melts around the base of this pot, there's a gap separating it from the kiln shelf. This means that even if the glaze does move a touch as it fires, it still won't fuse to the kiln shelf. So to some degree it's a small safety net, so to speak. Lastly, I trimmed a series of steps into the bottom of the jar, so that it relates somewhat to the lid on top. In a way, I really like it when there is a lot of care and attention put into the base of an object. Yes, it does mean that when displayed properly, you'll never see it, but when picked up and held and turned over, the owner, or whoever it is, discovers something slightly unusual. It's a surprise of sorts, which you may remember that I also did for a batch of cups I made recently. I'll leave a link to that video here if you'd like to see it. The real question is where to stamp a foot, like this, and I think in this instance, the middle felt the most appropriate, as I didn't want to interrupt the ledges that surround the outside. I then place the bottom of this jar on a HPL bat. That stands for high pressure laminate, and I place many of my freshly trimmed pots on these as the incredibly smooth surface obviously doesn't impart any texture on the still relatively soft clay. They're also perfectly flat and don't warp, which again just helps the vessels placed on top of them remain properly flat. I don't use them for everything, especially larger batches of pots, such as batches of mugs or bowls, which I make hundreds of at a time. But for one-off pieces like this, I pretty much use them all the time now. The last thing that's left to do is just tidy up the underside of the lid, as when I trimmed the steps in the side, it was the other way up, so I couldn't properly see what I was doing. But by turning it this way up, I can smooth over any surface that may have become slightly marked from the rim of the jar rubbing against it. And I can also further define the step, creating a sharper, neater right angle, again to hopefully cause the glazes to do something a bit more interesting. Anywhere there is a razor sharp edge, I do generally burnish it with my fingertip. And lastly, I flip the lid upside down and just check that top edge. And that's the clay work of the jar finished, but there's still a lot more left to go before this piece is properly complete. There is one thing I want to do. I want to insert some fragments of bronze, one in the lid and one in the body, to create two very simple points which you can line up. In a reduction-fired atmosphere, the copper in the bronze creates these wonderful red spots. But please be aware, if you do this in oxidation in an electric kiln, you'll get results that will look like this, which I don't like quite as much. I begin by sort of tacking them on the surface upright, and then I press them in flush. With that being done, unbeknownst to me, I was actually using clay that was already contaminated with bronze. So for all of you who've been asking for the constellation style pots, well, this one might be for you. But at this point in time, I only thought there were 2 specs inserted. And from this point, I've also become much better at labelling my reclaim. It's now about 2 weeks later, and the jar and its lid have turned completely bone dry. This means I can biscuit fire them in my electric kiln to 1000 degrees Celsius. This changes very fragile, recyclable clay into ceramic, which is much harder and can now no longer be dissolved in water. Clay's particles, the platelets, have started to fuse together, a process we call vitrification. And for glazing, we actually want our pots to only be partly vitrified, as this means the body can still absorb water, which is wholly necessary for the glazing process. As when pots are dipped into glaze, the water gets absorbed into the body, and this leaves a layer of the raw materials around the outside. And that's precisely why I'm waxing certain areas, as these are sections I don't want glaze to adhere to. If clay is fully fired to a hot enough temperature, it becomes fully vitrified. This means that the clay body itself is no longer absorbent. I'm using a really basic wax emulsion for this, by the way. I tend to water it down slightly as it just makes it brush on a bit more smoothly, and I make sure to dab a bit of extra wax in my maker's mark to properly seal it. The wax, by the way, just melts away during the firing, but I do wait for it to dry before dipping pots in glaze. For the body of the jar, I'm going to dip only the outside, which I'll do by inserting my arm into it and pushing it beneath the surface of the glaze. The reason I dip the outside like this is that it allows me to create a really smooth and even layer of glaze, which long term means there's less tidying up to do. But I won't coat the inside of this until the following day, after the walls of clay have dried out fully. As if I were to say wait 10 minutes for this layer to dry, pour glaze inside and then pour it out, the stoneware itself would already be saturated with water. This means that it wouldn't be able to pull in enough water when more glaze is poured inside it, and therefore a thick enough layer wouldn't adhere. Or it might, but then you can run into other issues, such as crawling, which is when the glaze begins to separate from itself, revealing patches of bare clay beneath it. The lid itself is altogether easier, as I can simply glaze it in one go. It's now the following day, and I fill the vessel up with the same glaze. I swirl it around inside, and then pour it out whilst twisting it, moving my hands delicately around the exterior surface as not to damage the delicate glaze. I could have very well glazed this piece the other way around, but say I had glazed the interior surface and then went to submerge it like I did before by pressing it underneath the surface of glaze, there's a chance I would damage the interior surface of glaze as I did it. It might not work for everybody, but it works for me, and this particular glaze. The next step is to tidy away any drips or drabs on the exterior surface, together with making sure that the rim and base are completely free of any glaze. In a way, the neater the surface is at this point, the better it's going to look once fired. But I also have to be really careful not to wipe away too much from any particular point, as it's relatively easy to create a thin patch that will then fire into a sort of brownish colour instead of the pale green I want. Yes, this pink glaze will turn green once reduction fired. It contains 1% red iron oxide, and it's that which is giving it this pink tone. But once fired in my gas kiln in a reduction atmosphere, it'll create a subtle green colour. Despite the base being waxed, there is still always some glaze that clings onto it, so I wipe over the bottom with a wet sponge to soak all the remnants away, to create a really clean, neat surface, especially around the outside where the clay body meets the glaze. Next is the lid. I begin by wiping over the tongue marks I used to dip this piece into the glaze. I'm quite lucky in one regard, as this glaze dries into a really powdery, soft layer, which I can just fettle back with my fingertips like so. On the other spectrum, there are glazes that you can't really touch up like this without the marks remaining very obvious. And if that is the case, then you basically just have to figure out different ways of glazing your pots. Be it brushing or spraying, pouring it, or using tongs in a more tactical way, perhaps so they only come into contact with bare clay, or they're hidden, say within the base of a cup, or beneath the handle. I speak about this rather a lot, as I think sometimes people watch my videos and perhaps get the impression that the techniques I show might be best for their practice too, when in fact you may need an entirely different way of doing it. What I'm saying is there isn't just one way of making pottery, and no matter what, you do have to do your own testing. The next thing I'm going to do is prop the lid up using a clay-like material I make myself from 50% coarse alumina hydrate and 50% china clay. This is actually another topic I've made a much longer video about, a link to which I'll leave on screen now and in the description below. But essentially I create small discs which I press against the waxed surface, and then I'll slot this on top of the jar, the waddings holding it slightly aloft, so neither component, lid or body, are actually touching. This way they don't fire and fuse together, and I save space in the kiln by not firing these components separately. It also means that the two parts match, if say the internal atmosphere of the kiln does create slightly different tones across the piece. And with that, the jar can finally be packed into my gas kiln for its reduction firing to cone 10. This starts early in the morning, the kiln lit with the door open so that gas doesn't accumulate inside. The early stages of the firing are taken really slowly, and unlike my electric kiln, which is completely automatic, this one is controlled entirely by hand. At 860 degrees precisely, I initiate the reduction atmosphere. This is done by sliding the damper to half cover the flues at the back. I also increase the gas and air pressure. This causes too much fuel to accumulate inside the chamber with a lack of oxygen for it to burn properly. As a result, the burning atmosphere finds oxygen in the clay and glazes themselves, stripping it out and chemically changing the iron. And it's this that creates the green and blue tones that are characteristic of Celadon glazes, which I suppose the glazes I use are very similar to. The top temperature I reach is about 1290 degrees Celsius, and from this high it takes about 2 days to cool down properly, whereupon the kiln can be cracked open and the pots finally unpacked. The jar is somewhere in the back, and already I was really surprised by the surface, as of course I only thought there were going to be 2 crimson dots, not the multitude that have ended up covering the surface. Now, before I take a look at this pot properly, I'm first going to sand the base smooth, which I do using some diamond pads made by Diamond Core Tools. The next step is removing the lid. I'm hoping it'll come off with relative ease, as you never know quite how stuck they're going to be. That was really painless compared to some I've had. There are times where I'll sit and tap the lid quite gently with a block of wood, hitting all the way around it to try and dislodge it. The others come off with a bit of pressure, but at the moment the lid sounds horrible when spun in place, as the stoneware has shrunk around the coarse particles of grog contained in the body. Therefore, all that time I spent burnishing the clay is sort of for nothing, I suppose. To fix this, I smeared this stuff, Chemico valve lapping paste, on the underside of the lid. This is essentially powdered carborundum suspended in gel, and by then slotting the 2 parts together and twisting them in place, The excess clay that's causing it to not fit quite right is ground away, leaving it with a much smoother finish. The worst of the paste is scraped back into the jar, but I use a scrap of paper just to get rid of any residue left over. And of course, as this stuff is rather greasy, to remove it properly, I have to wash it off using hot, soapy water. I also just ran a diamond pad around the rim, as there were a few sharp specks of grog left. It's then given a really thorough wash in hot, soapy water to get rid of all of it. The jar was then set out to dry, and here it is, with all those extra dots. It's far more dramatic than the initial idea I had, but I do really like it. The copper spots add a lot of visual interest, and it does help to draw your eye around the vessel, which is no bad thing. I think by now you should have realised that I kind of look at these as art pieces, as compared to objects with simply a functional use. The top of the lid is lovely and flat, and has such an interesting pattern from where the glaze is pooled thickly, and it's broken around the edge into a much warmer tone, again breaking up what would otherwise be a very uniform surface. I think the underside of the jar is my favourite part, and since sanding the stoneware smooth, it's a very satisfying and tactile area to run your fingers over. You can see how the glaze is hung on that bottom edge I was speaking about earlier, and how it's pooled on this flat section at the top. And you know, despite my apprehension of making pots like this with really random dots in, I actually like this jar more than I thought I would. Although, as much as I've been calling it a jar, I think this really feels like an urn to me, and I know for a fact that that's actually how many of my store jars have ended up being used, which, despite everything that goes along with that, knowing that the choice has been made by somebody to place a loved one's ashes in a pot of mine makes me both feel very honoured and very emotional. Anyhow, that's all for this week. Let me know what you think of this jar, and if you like the sort of arbitrary crimson dots that cover it. A huge thanks if you made it all the way to the end. And, as always, I'll see you next week.